My name is Nadia Osei, and I was 33 years old the week my mother handed me a single sheet of paper across the kitchen table and told me they had made their decision. The paper was a letter from their estate attorney. It wasn't the will itself, just a formal summary of changes made. My name had been removed as primary beneficiary. My younger brother Marcus had been moved up. The letter used words like updated distribution and revised structure. My mother watched me read it and said, "We gave you every chance, Nadia. We really did." I folded the letter along its original crease. I set it on the table. I said, "Okay." She looked at me like she was waiting for more. There wasn't more. My husband Theo was in the car. He had offered to come in, and I had told him to wait. When I got back in the passenger seat and he looked at me, I said, "They did it." He took my hand and said, "Let them." And I held on to that, "let them," for the next 13 months, every time the doubt tried to find a foothold. There was something Theo had never told my family. Something documented, formal, older than our relationship. I knew what it was. They did not. And on the night of the Regional Transit Authority's annual board dinner, in a room of 300 people, the introduction began. Welcome back to Channel, where quiet people let the document speak first. If you're new here, subscribe. New stories every week, and the comment section is full of people who have been exactly where Nadia is standing right now. I want to tell you about the kind of family I come from before I tell you what happened at that dinner, because the two things are completely inseparable, and if I skip the first part, the second part won't make the kind of sense it needs to make. My parents, Douglas and Miriam Osei, immigrated from Ghana to Canada in their late 20s, settled in Mississauga, Ontario, and spent the next 3 decades building the specific kind of immigrant success story that their generation treated as both achievement and obligation. My father became a licensed pharmacist and eventually owned 2 locations. My mother ran the back office of both while also raising my brother Marcus and me, keeping the household, and maintaining a social network that functioned like a second career. They worked hard and they were proud of what they had built, and they communicated that pride in the particular way of parents who want their children to exceed them, constantly, specifically, and with detailed metrics attached. The metrics were not subtle. By the time I was in university, my parents had a clear model of what a successful life looked like, and it had several line items: a recognized professional designation, a spouse from a comparable family background, a home in a desirable postal code, and children enrolled in good schools. My brother Marcus had obliged on nearly every count. He was a chartered accountant, married to a woman named Priya, whose parents ran a medical practice in Brampton, lived in a semi-detached in Oakville, and had a daughter in French immersion. My parents mentioned Marcus at an average rate of once every 45 minutes when I was in the same room as them. Not boastfully, exactly. Just as a reference point. A calibration tool. I was a transit planner. I had a master's degree in urban planning from the University of Toronto and had spent 7 years working for a regional planning consultancy that contracted with municipal transit authorities across southern Ontario. I was good at my work. Genuinely, specifically good, the kind of good that gets you called back on complex projects and asked to present findings to city councils. I liked the work. I liked the specific problem of moving large numbers of people through a built environment efficiently and equitably. I liked that it mattered in a tangible way, that if I did my job correctly, a nurse who didn't own a car could get to her shift on time, a kid in a suburban high school could get to hockey practice without his parents burning a vacation day. It was not glamorous work. It did not produce a business card with a title that landed well at dinner parties. But it was mine, and I was good at it. My parents respected it the way they respected a minor appliance. It worked, it was useful. They were not interested in the mechanics. The relationship with Theo began the way a lot of things in my life have begun, practically without ceremony, during a work problem. I was on site for a route assessment in Hamilton, observing peak-hour boarding patterns on a corridor that the authority was considering restructuring. Theo Anderson was the driver on Route 41 that morning, a tall, quiet man in his early 40s with a Scandinavian-sounding last name and very precise habits. He announced stops at exactly the right moment. He waited the correct number of seconds before pulling away from the curb. When a woman with a stroller needed the ramp lowered, he had it down before she finished asking. I was in the 3rd row with a clipboard, And at the end of his shift, I asked if I could ask him a few questions about the corridor. He said yes, sat down across from me at a coffee counter near the terminal, and for 40 minutes gave me the most operationally accurate assessment of that route I had received from anyone on the entire project, including the authorities' own traffic engineers. I asked for his contact information for follow-up questions. He gave it to me. 3 weeks later, I asked if he wanted to have dinner, and I want to be clear that this was the more professional question. He said yes to that too. Theo Anderson was 41, had been driving for the Hamilton Street Railway for 9 years, and was the most quietly composed person I had ever spent time with. He did not perform. He did not explain himself. He did not adjust his presentation based on who was in the room or what they thought of him. He read history mostly and transit infrastructure literature that most people would consider entirely impenetrable for leisure. He cooked well. He had a daughter from a previous relationship named B, who was 14 and came every other weekend, and with whom he had the specific low-key ease of a parent who had put in the consistent hours. He was not flashy. He drove a used Civic. His apartment had 3 rooms and good light, and a shelf of books organized by subject. He had also, before driving for the HSR, spent 8 years on the board of the Regional Transit Authority of Hamilton as a community representative, been appointed to a permanent non-executive director role, and was currently the board's longest-serving member in that capacity. He had been involved in every major service redesign in the region for the better part of a decade. He knew the authority's budget, its political landscape, its long-term capital plan, and its operational challenges better than most of the people who were paid to know them. He had never mentioned this to my parents. They had never asked. The subject had simply never arisen, because my parents' questions for Theo stopped at, "What do you do?" and did not proceed from there. The one person in my family who had ever gotten close to understanding Theo was my father's mother, my grandmother Adwoa, who was 78 and lived in a senior's residence in Mississauga and received visitors on Wednesday afternoons with the gracious authority of a woman holding court. Grandma Adwoa had met Theo twice before she said anything definitive about him. The second time, on a Wednesday in March, she had asked him a question about the Hamilton waterfront transit study she had read about in the newspaper. Theo had answered her in detail for 15 minutes. She had listened with her hands folded in her lap and her chin slightly raised. Afterwards, she had looked at me and said, in Chui so that only I could follow it fully, "This one knows things. The quiet ones always know things. Your parents look, but they don't see." I had said in English, "I know, Grandma." She had said in English, "Don't argue with them. Let time do the work. Time is very rude to foolish assumptions." I had written that down when I got home. I kept it in my phone. I read it, on average, once every 2 weeks for the next year. The first dinner went the way first dinners go when the family has already formed their opinion and is managing the gap between the opinion and the person sitting in front of them. My father asked Theo what his route was. Theo told him. My father nodded and said, "Stable work," in the tone of a man providing the most positive framing he could locate. My mother asked whether the union offered good benefits. Theo said yes, the benefits were good. Marcus asked whether Theo had considered the supervisory track. Theo said he was content where he was. Priya, to her credit, asked about B and listened to the answer with what appeared to be genuine interest. The rest of the meal was surface weather, the safe topics, the family news, the comfortable middle distance of people who have collectively decided not to land anywhere specific. On the drive home, Theo drove, and I watched the highway lights, and neither of us said anything for about 10 minutes. Then I said, "I'm sorry." He said, "What for?" I said, "They weren't particularly." "They were fine," he said. "They were worried about you. That's what it is." A pause. "I don't need them to like me tonight. I need them to be accurate about me eventually. Those are different timelines." I looked at him. He was watching the road. I thought about what was in the filing cabinet in his apartment, the board appointment letters, the formal documentation, the citation from the authorities' 25th anniversary. I thought about the timeline. I thought, eventually is closer than he knows. The second dinner was worse because it was more practiced. My parents had settled into their positions. My father had a register for Theo now, genial, slightly elevated in the way you are with someone you have categorized as a pleasant non-peer, and he used it consistently. My mother had developed a habit of addressing her questions about our shared life to me rather than to Theo, as if gathering information about a third party rather than speaking to the person at the table. Is Theo thinking about the supervisor track yet, Nadia? Not. Theo, have you thought about it? The third-person construction was so consistent that Marcus finally laughed and said, Mom, Theo's right there. And my mother had smiled and said, Oh, I know, and moved on. Theo had not reacted. He had eaten his jollof rice, and when Marcus's wife Priya had asked him directly about the authorities' new fare integration project, she had read about it. She said it seemed interesting. He had spent 20 minutes explaining it in a way that was clear and engaged and informative, and I had watched Priya's expression move from polite interest to genuine attention somewhere around minute 7. On the drive home that time I did not apologize. He did not wait for it. We got engaged 6 months after we started dating. I told my parents on a Sunday call. My mother said, Oh, Nadia. Not the warm version. The weight-bearing version. The one that has a full sentence behind it that she has decided not to say. My father said, Are you certain this is what you want? I said, Yes, Dad. He said, We just want to make sure you've thought about the practical side. I said I had. He said, Okay then. We set the wedding for the following September. It was small, 60 people, a hall in Hamilton, a Ghanaian ceremony in the morning and a civil ceremony in the afternoon. Theo's family came from Guelph and from Sweden, his mother and 2 sisters, and a brother-in-law who cried at both ceremonies and hugged me so hard I had to recalibrate my balance. My grandmother Adwoa sat in the front row and did not cry, but held my hand for the full length of the civil ceremony and did not let go. My parents were present, dressed beautifully, behaved without incident, and stayed for 2 hours before my mother said she had a headache and they left. 4 days later, the letter came. It was a Thursday evening. I had just gotten home from a site visit in Burlington. Theo was at his kitchen table with a transit budget document and a cup of coffee that had gone cold. My phone rang, my mother, and she said in the practiced tone of someone delivering a decision they have rehearsed that they needed me to come over that weekend, that there were some things to discuss. I went alone. I told Theo where I was going. He said, Do you want me to come? I said no, that this was between me and my parents, that it would be better handled without an audience. He looked at me with the particular expression I had come to recognize as his version of disagreement held in reserve and said, Okay, call me when you leave. My parents' house in Mississauga is a 4-bedroom detached in a quiet crescent that my father bought in 2003 and has maintained with the specific care of a man for whom property is a form of testimony. The lawn is always cut. The paint is always fresh. There are flowers in the front bed that my mother replants every spring. I grew up in that house and I know every sound it makes. My mother met me at the door. She brought me to the kitchen, not the living room, not the dining room, the kitchen, which is the room for conversations that do not require ceremony. She had tea ready. My father was at the kitchen table already, in his reading glasses, with his hands folded in a way that told me he had been sitting there long enough to arrange himself. My mother sat down. She slid a single piece of paper across the table toward me. I picked it up. It was a letter from their estate attorney, a formal notification that the distribution of their estate had been revised. My name remained a beneficiary but had been moved to a secondary position. Marcus had been designated primary. The letter cited no reason beyond updated distribution reflecting current wishes. It was signed by the attorney and countersigned by both my parents. I read it twice. The kitchen was very quiet, the refrigerator cycling, a car on the street outside, nothing else. My mother said, We gave you every chance, Nadia. We really did. My father said, It's not about punishing you. That's not what this is. We just need you to understand that decisions have weight. You made a choice and we're making ours. It's that simple. I folded the letter along its crease. I set it on the table. I said, Okay. My mother's hands moved toward her teacup and stopped. She had expected more. The shape of the conversation she had prepared for required more. She said, You're not going to say anything? You've made your decision, I said. I heard you. My father took his glasses off. He set them on the table. He said, Nadia, this is not what we wanted for you. You have a degree. You have a good career. There were options. He paused. Theo seems like a decent man. We're not saying he isn't. We just think about what your life looks like in 20 years. What the structure is. You understand. I understood that he believed this. That was the hardest part. It was not performance, it was not cruelty for its own sake. He had a model of stability and legibility, and he was applying it to my life with the full force of his love and the complete blindness of a man who had stopped asking questions before he had all the information. I stood up. I picked up the letter. I said, I'll let you know if there's anything I need to discuss with the attorney. I kissed my mother on the cheek. I shook my father's hand because that is what we do in my family when the conversation is formal and finished. I walked to my car. I sat in the driver's seat for 60 seconds. Then I called Theo. He picked up on the second ring. I told him what had happened. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, let them. 2 words, clean and certain, and I held them like ballast for the drive back to Hamilton. The months that followed were defined by the particular discipline of maintaining a relationship with people who had, in their own minds, reached a conclusion about you, and were now simply waiting for events to confirm it. My parents continued to invite us to things. My mother called on Sundays. My father sent articles occasionally about property markets, about pension planning, about the kind of practical infrastructure of a life he thought we were not building. I went to the dinners. I answered the calls. I read the articles and replied with a single sentence. Theo came to 2 dinners in that stretch. At both, he was exactly as he always was. Present, direct, unperformative, precise when asked a question, and quiet when not. My father managed him with the benign efficiency of a man who has decided that the situation is unfortunate but stable. My mother asked him once, in March at a birthday dinner for my father, whether he had thought about eventually transitioning to operations management at the authority. Theo said, my role with the authority is already in a different lane, but thank you. My mother smiled and moved on, and I watched her file different lane under further evidence and say nothing. Priya, who had by this point become the person in the family I most trusted, pulled me aside at that same dinner and said quietly, does your mom know what Theo actually does? Like, beyond the driving? I said, she knows what she's decided to know. Priya looked at me for a moment and said, this is going to be a very good story someday. I said, I know. My grandmother Adwoa called me in April. She was not given to calls. She preferred visits, believed the phone was for logistics and emergencies. But she called on a Wednesday, her visiting day, and said she had been thinking. She said, your parents are going to embarrass themselves. I want you to know that I know that, even if I can't stop them. She said, when it happens, be kind. They are not bad people. They are people who stopped learning and called it wisdom. She said, your husband is building something real. I don't know exactly what it is, but I know the shape of a man who is building something. You can tell. I said, he is, Grandma. She said, good. Then wait. I waited. The announcement came in July. The Regional Transit Authority of Hamilton was holding its annual board dinner in October, a formal event, 300 guests, civic leaders, donors, transit advocates, municipal partners. The dinner included the presentation of the authority's long-term service expansion plan, which Theo had been centrally involved in developing over the preceding 2 years. The board chair had asked Theo to deliver the keynote address. I found out because Theo came home one evening with a printed invitation and set it on the kitchen counter and said, they want me to speak. He said it the way he says everything, directly, without inflation. I looked at the invitation. I looked at his name above the words keynote address. I looked at the line below that, Director of Community Integration, Regional Transit Authority of Hamilton, board member since 2014. I said, are you going to say yes? He said, I think so. I said, then I think we should make sure my parents are there. He looked at me. He understood. He said, that's your call to make. It was. I made it. I called my mother the following week and mentioned the dinner in the context of a broader conversation about fall plans. I said it was a significant civic event, that it would be covered by local media, that the authority was presenting a major infrastructure announcement. I said Theo had a role in the evening. I did not specify what role. My mother said it sounded like an interesting evening, and could she let me know? I said of course. 2 weeks later she confirmed. She and my father would attend. I said, I'm glad. It'll be a good night. I meant every word of that. The dinner was held at the Hamilton Convention Center on a cool Thursday evening in October, the kind of night where the air has real weight to it and the lights on the waterfront carry farther than usual. The center's main hall had been set for 300 round tables with the authorities branding on the programs and a low stage at the front with a clean podium and 2 retractable screens. The room filled steadily from 6:30 onward, counselors, city staff, transit advocates, union representatives, private sector partners, journalists from 2 local outlets and 1 regional one. Theo and I arrived at 6:15. He had a pre-dinner meeting with the board chair and the event coordinator, so we separated at the door, and I found our table, table 11 mid-room, good sightline to the stage, and got a glass of water and let myself settle into the room. I had dressed simply, a deep green wrap dress I had owned for 3 years, low heels, the small gold earrings my grandmother had given me when I graduated. I did not feel the need to dress for an occasion that was already going to be the occasion. My parents arrived at 6:50. I saw them before they saw me. My father in a dark suit, my mother in a structured burgundy dress that I knew she had bought for formal events because she had mentioned it at dinner the previous spring. They were with Marcus and Priya, which I had not anticipated. Marcus had been invited as a business contact of one of the authorities' financial partners. Priya told me this later, and also told me that Marcus had said in the car on the way over that it was good for Theo to have a civic event to attend, that it was probably good for his confidence. I let that go. Some information is only useful in retrospect. My mother found me at table 11. She hugged me, told me my dress was lovely, looked around the room with the expression of a woman doing a rapid social inventory. She said, "This is quite a turnout." I said, "The authorities been building toward this announcement for 2 years. It's a significant night." She nodded, looking at the program. She said, "It says there's a keynote. Someone named." She looked at the program. "Theo Anderson." She looked up at me. I watched her face process the name. I watched the first small gear catch. Is that your Theo?" "Yes," I said. She looked at the program again. Below his name, Director of Community Integration, Regional Transit Authority of Hamilton. Board member, 2014, present. I watched her read it. Her mouth moved slightly on the word director. Then again on board member. Then she looked at the year. 2014, for years before we had met. She said, "Nadia." Just my name. No sentence attached. I said, "He doesn't really lead with titles." She looked at the stage. She looked at me. She reached for my father's arm and showed him the program without saying anything, just pointed at the line under Theo's name and let him read it. My father's jaw tightened. Not in anger, in the specific muscular response of a man revising a load-bearing assumption. He read the line twice. I watched his eyes move from director to board member to 2014 and back. He set the program down on the table with the careful deliberateness of someone who needs a moment. Marcus, on his other side, leaned over and looked at the program. He said nothing. Priya, next to him, caught my eye across the table, and her expression did the thing it does when she is performing perfect neutrality over complete understanding. My father said, in a voice that was very controlled, "He's on the board." I said, "Yes." "Since 2014. "Yes." He nodded once, the slow nod of arithmetic completing itself. He picked up his water glass and set it down without drinking from it. We found our seats. My parents' table was table 6, slightly closer to the stage, a placement I noticed they didn't seem to be tracking as clearly as they usually would. Marcus sat down and reached for the breadbasket. Priya sat beside him with a careful composure of someone who has understood the subtext and has decided to let it develop without editorial comment. Dinner was served. I ate. I was not anxious. That is the truest thing I can tell you about those 90 minutes. I was not anxious. I had been anxious for 13 months, and the anxiety had burned itself out somewhere between July and October, replaced by something quieter and more stable, something that felt like the particular calm of a person who has been carrying a fact for a long time and is about to be relieved of it. Partway through the main course, my father appeared at my shoulder. He had crossed the room for tables, and he crouched slightly to speak at my level, which is something he does when he wants a private word in a public room. He said, "Why didn't you tell us?" I said, "You didn't ask." He looked at me for a moment. He said, "We asked what he did." I said, "You asked what route he drove. He told you." Another moment. He said, "That's not," and then stopped, because whatever completed that sentence was not something he wanted to say in the middle of a banquet hall. He straightened up. He said, "We'll talk after." And he went back to his table. I watched him sit down. I watched him say something to my mother. I watched her set her fork on the edge of her plate and not pick it up again for 2 full minutes. Dessert was cleared. The lights on the stage came up. The board chair, a woman named Counselor Diane Ferreira, who had been in the role for 6 years, took the podium. She was efficient and warm in equal measure, the kind of public speaker who has given enough speeches to know which parts require gravity and which parts can breathe. She spoke for 12 minutes about the authority's history, the growth of the transit network, the coming service expansion. She cited ridership numbers that had increased 40% over the decade. She talked about what the expansion plan would mean for the communities it reached, not abstractly but specifically, naming routes and neighborhoods and the populations they served. And then she said, "The plan you'll see presented tonight has been a decade in development. It exists because this board made a commitment, years ago, to genuine community integration, to building our service around the people who depend on it rather than around the metrics that are easiest to measure." The person most responsible for building and sustaining that commitment has served on this board for 11 years. He came to this work not as an administrator, not as a political appointee, but as someone who has been part of this community's daily transit story from the ground level up. He is, in every sense, the reason tonight's announcement is possible. Please welcome our keynote speaker and the board's director of community integration, Theo Anderson. 300 people applauded. It was genuine. The warm, full-room sound of people who know the name and are glad to see it called out. Theo walked from the side of the room to the stage with the same gait he uses to walk to the corner to get coffee. He adjusted the microphone once. He waited for the applause to settle completely before he said a word. He spoke for 14 minutes. He did not use notes. He described the development of the expansion plan in terms that were technically precise and humanly clear. He talked about the Binbrook corridor redesign, about the accessible service gaps that the new plan addressed, about 2 specific community consultation sessions from 2021 and 2022 that had changed the board's assumptions about evening service on 3 routes. He cited numbers cleanly. He named 2 staff members who had done foundational research and asked them to stand while the room applauded. He thanked the authority's operating staff, the drivers, the maintenance teams, with the specificity of someone who has actually spent time on those buses. At no point did he look at table 6. When he finished, Counselor Ferreira returned to the podium and said, "Theo, before you sit down, the board wanted to mark 11 years with something a little more formal." She nodded to a staff member at the side of the stage, who brought forward a framed resolution, the authority's formal citation for his service, which Ferreira read in full. It listed the programs he had developed, the policy changes he had shaped, the service expansions he had championed. It used the phrase, transformative contribution, twice. The room applauded again, longer this time. I watched table 6. My father was applauding. He was doing it correctly, hands together, the right number of times. But his face during that applause, I have thought about it many times since. It was the face of a man who has opened a filing cabinet he thought was empty and found it full, and who is now standing at the open drawer trying to account for how he missed it. He was going backward through every dinner, every conversation where my mother had asked Theo about the supervisor track, the evening my father had asked about the route. He was recalibrating at speed, the way you recalibrate when you realize the error is not in the data, but in the question you were asking. My mother had reached for his arm during Counselor Ferreira's reading of the citation. Her fingers were on his sleeve, and her face was turned toward the stage, but not entirely focused on it. The way a face looks when part of its attention is directed inward at something it is struggling to resolve. When the applause started, she joined it, but her eyes moved to me across the 4 tables between us, and when they found me, she held the look for a long moment. I did not smile. I did not nod. I held the look, and then I looked back at the stage where Theo was stepping down with the framed citation under his arm. Marcus, at table 6, had stopped applauding before everyone else. He was looking at the program in front of him. Priya was applauding fully, and at some point she turned and said something to Marcus, and Marcus said something back, and whatever it was caused Priya to look at her plate and press her lips together in the specific way she presses them when she is choosing not to laugh. Theo came back to table 11. He set the citation on the table. I put my hand over his and he put his other hand over mine, the 3-layer stack we've been doing since we were first dating, and did not say anything because there was nothing to say. He got up shortly after to make a circuit of the room. There were people who wanted to speak with him, partners and counselors and 2 journalists. I stayed at the table. I had more water. I watched the room. A woman I didn't recognize came to sit beside me, late 50s, good posture, a city councilor's pin on her lapel. She said, "You're Theo's wife?" I said yes. She said, "I've been on council for 4 years, and I have been trying to get the authority to listen to half of what's in that expansion plan for 3 of them. Your husband has been the one keeping it alive internally. I want you to know that." She squeezed my hand once, briefly, and went back to her own table. I sat with that. I thought about my grandmother. I thought about time is very rude to foolish assumptions. I thought, yes, very. My father found me as the room was beginning to thin, the after-dinner circulation moving toward coats and goodbyes. He came directly this time, no crouching, no private word. He came to where I was standing near the side of the room, and he stood in front of me with his hands at his sides and the particular expression of a man who has located what he needs to say and is not going to dress it up. He said, "We were wrong about him." Not, "We didn't know." Not, "You should have told us." We were wrong about him. I want to be precise about the words because they were the right words and he chose them deliberately, and I think that cost him something. I said, "I know." He said, "Why didn't you tell us what he did? The board. All of it." I said, "Dad, you asked him what route he drove. You offered him a job in operations management. You rewrote your will." I paused. I didn't think more information was what the situation needed. He was quiet. His jaw worked once slightly, the way it does when he is processing something that he disagrees with on reflex but cannot actually counter. He said, "That's fair." 3 words from my father that carry more weight than most people's paragraphs. He said, "I'd like to speak to him." I said, "He's near the stage. He's finishing up with the counselors." My father went. I watched him cross the room. I watched him find Theo in conversation with 2 men I didn't recognize, wait with the patience of a man who has learned to wait, and then, when the others moved on, extend his hand. Theo shook it. My father kept hold of it for a moment and said something I couldn't hear.
"Theo lidt stand."
He nodded once. He said something back. My father's hand went to Theo's shoulder briefly, the gesture of a man making a physical acknowledgement he doesn't have the vocabulary for yet. Then they both turned toward the stage, where a staff member was explaining something about the expansion map, and they looked at it together. I did not go over. That was their conversation. I let it be theirs. My mother found me near the coat check. She was holding her own coat rather than wearing it, the way people hold coats when they are not quite ready to leave but know the evening is over. She said, "I owe you an apology, Nadia." She said it quietly and without preamble, which is not her usual register. She usually builds toward difficult things from a distance. This was direct. I said, "Mom." She said, "No, let me say it. I made it about the job title. I made it about what things looked like. And I knew, when I did it, that you would have told us if there was something to tell. I just thought," she stopped. "I thought we knew better than you, about what mattered." She looked at her coat in her hands. "We didn't." I said, "You wanted me looked after. I know that." She said, "He has been looking after you." That was the part one wasn't seeing. She looked up at me. Her eyes were doing the thing where they are holding something back through effort. I touched her arm once. She pressed her lips together, steadied, and said, "The attorney, the will. We'll have that corrected." I said, "That's your business, Mom. Do what you think is right." She looked at me for a moment like she wanted me to push her in a specific direction. I didn't. It was her decision, and it needed to be made from her own accounting rather than from pressure. She had it corrected within 2 weeks. She mentioned it in a phone call the following Sunday, briefly, as a fact rather than a gesture requiring acknowledgement. I said, "Okay. Thank you, Mom." She said, "That's all." And we moved on. Marcus was the most interesting case in some ways because he was the one who had the least language for what had happened. He had not been overtly cruel to Theo. He had just been consistent in a small way, the steady low-level condescension of a sibling who has measured himself against you and arrived at a comfortable margin. He called me the week after the dinner, ostensibly to talk about something else, and about 15 minutes in said, "So, Theo?" I said, "Yes?" He said, "I had no idea." I said, "I know." He said, "You could have said something, Nadia." I said, "You could have asked Marcus." A silence. Then he said, "Fair enough." A pause. Does he want to have dinner sometime? Like the 4 of us? I'd actually like to talk to him properly. I said yes. Dinner happened the following month. Marcus asked Theo about the expansion plan, and the conversation ran 2.5 hours. Priya texted me that night. "I have been waiting for that conversation for literally a year. Worth every second." My grandmother Adwoa heard the full account on a Wednesday afternoon in November. She listened to all of it with her hands folded and her chin slightly raised, and when I finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Did your father shake his hand?" I said, "He put his hand on Theo's shoulder." She said, "That's better than a handshake." She smoothed the arm of her chair. "What did I tell you about time?" I said, "That it's very rude to foolish assumptions." She said, "Precisely." She reached for her tea. "Now, tell me about the expansion plan." Theo explained some of it to me last month, but I want to understand the Binbrook corridor specifically. And I told her. For 40 minutes. She listened to every word. "I have thought about what my father said at that kitchen table. Decisions have weight. You made a choice, and we're making ours." He was right about that part. What he didn't account for is that some decisions are made with incomplete information and some with full information, and only one of those is actually a decision. He decided about Theo from a route number and a job title, and he held that decision like it was a structure when it was only a sketch. Theo had never needed my family's accounting of him. He had been building something real for 11 years before they had ever seen his face. The room delivered the verdict. He just showed up and told the truth about the work. The quietest people are sometimes the ones who have built the most. That's not a secret they're keeping, it's just that they stopped needing to announce it a long time ago. That's my story. A single page slid across a kitchen table, a program with a name on it, and a man who never once raised his voice. Here is what I want to know from you. Has someone in your life ever been dismissed by people who hadn't done the first work of actually knowing them, and then the room found out on its own, without you having to say a word? Did you feel relief, or something more complicated than that? Drop your answer in the comments. Drop a comment, hit subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.